In a town like Salisbury, Maryland, where everyone knows each other's business, scandal is a rare thing. It's a place where people live their lives quietly, trusting in their neighbors and in their local heroes, especially their doctors. So, when the news broke about the mysterious death of 26-year-old artist Aaron Cole, the community was shaken to its core. But that shock quickly turned into something much darker. Because this wasn't just any tragedy. Aaron's death was no accident, and the real surprise came when the town's most beloved figure, Dr. Meredith Larson, became entangled in the investigation. Meredith Larson wasn't just a doctor. For over 40 years, she had been a pillar of the community, a kind, trustworthy woman who treated generations of Salisbury families. She was respected, even loved, for her compassionate care and for always being there when someone needed her. But what nobody knew, not her patients, not her colleagues, and certainly not her friends, was that Dr. Larson had been leading a secret, double life. A life that involved 3 young men, each of them patients, each of them falling deeply, dangerously in love with her. As word spread through the town about Meredith's connection to Aaron's death, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath the feet of everyone who had ever sat in her exam room. The calm, composed doctor they all thought they knew had crossed a line, one that would soon lead investigators to uncover a tangled web of desire, obsession, and betrayal. It all started innocently enough. An older woman, nearing the end of her career, perhaps feeling a bit lonely, a bit unfulfilled. She had dedicated her life to her patients, but outside of work, her world was empty. Her house, large and silent, offered her little comfort. The town respected her, but respect isn't the same as love. She wanted something more, something that would make her feel alive again. And then she met Matthew Granger, a personal trainer in his early 30s, young, handsome, full of life. He wasn't like the men Meredith usually dealt with. Matthew came to her clinic after a gym injury, looking for help. And what began as a simple doctor-patient relationship quickly turned into something far more intimate. But as this forbidden romance bloomed, it was only the beginning of a much darker descent. A descent that would soon involve 2 more men. Daniel Ward, a fragile 28-year-old battling depression, and Aaron Cole, an artist with a troubled past, whose obsession with Meredith would spiral into something uncontrollable. As investigators began to peel back the layers of Meredith's life, they realized that the truth was far more complex than they could have imagined. And soon, the question wasn't just how Aaron Cole had died, but why Dr. Meredith Larson had let it all happen. Matthew Granger wasn't like the other patients Meredith had treated over the years. At 31, he was confident, attractive, and had the kind of youthful energy that drew people to him. He came to Meredith after a gym injury, a torn shoulder that required care and rehabilitation. At first, it was just another case for her, another patient in need of her expertise. But as their sessions went on, something changed. Matthew had a charm about him. He knew how to flirt, how to turn on the charm without coming across as desperate. For a woman like Meredith, who had been without affection for so long, this was something new, something dangerous. His compliments came slowly at first. "You don't look your age," he'd say with a smile. Or, "You're the most intelligent person I know." Harmless, she told herself. Just words. But Matthew was relentless. He'd linger after appointments, making small talk that soon drifted into something more personal. He'd talk about his life, his ambitions, his frustrations. And Meredith, lonely and craving connection, found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't done with anyone else. For the first time in years, Meredith felt alive. She felt desired, wanted. It was intoxicating, and before long, what had started as innocent flirtation turned into something far more dangerous. Matthew pushed the boundaries, and Meredith, against her better judgment, allowed him to. Their relationship began in secret, of course. Meetings after hours, stolen moments in the quiet of her office. At first it thrilled her, the thrill of doing something forbidden, something reckless. Matthew made her feel young again, reminded her of a side of herself she thought had long since faded away. But with that excitement came a cost. Matthew was demanding. He wanted more of her time, more of her attention. He'd show up unannounced at her clinic, sometimes when she was with other patients, forcing her to cover up their relationship. At first, it was flattering. But as time went on, Meredith began to feel trapped, overwhelmed by Matthew's constant need for attention. She tried to pull away, but Matthew wouldn't let her. He'd call late at night, insisting that she meet him. He wasn't just charming anymore, he was possessive. And Meredith, who had started to enjoy the power she held over this younger man, found herself losing control. But Matthew was just the beginning. It wasn't long after her affair with Matthew began that another patient entered Meredith's life. Daniel Ward. Unlike Matthew, Daniel wasn't charming or confident. He was quiet, fragile, emotionally broken. A 28-year-old man struggling with severe anxiety and depression. And where Matthew was demanding and assertive, Daniel was desperate for someone to save him. Meredith, with her need to be needed, found herself drawn to Daniel's vulnerability. He needed her in a way Matthew never could. He wasn't after her for her looks or charm. He needed her for emotional support. Someone to lean on when his world felt too heavy to bear. And that, for Meredith, was its own kind of intoxicating. She began spending extra time with Daniel, listening to his worries, offering him the kind of comfort that went far beyond the role of a doctor. Their relationship crossed the line quickly, but in a different way from Matthew. Daniel wasn't physical or demanding. He was emotionally dependent. He called her at all hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, needing to talk through his anxiety attacks. And Meredith, feeling that familiar sense of importance, couldn't bring herself to turn him away. But as her entanglement with Daniel deepened, so did the danger. She was juggling two men now, one demanding her time, the other clinging to her emotionally. And soon, that delicate balance would start to crumble. Just as Meredith was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the demands of Matthew and the emotional weight of Daniel, a third man entered her life, Aaron Cole. At 26, Aaron was the youngest of the three, and unlike the others, he wasn't simply seeking comfort or affection. Aaron was intense, he was unpredictable, and above all, he was dangerous. Aaron came to Meredith's clinic for help managing his mental health. An artist by trade, his life was fueled by emotion and creativity. But those same qualities that made him passionate also made him unstable. His moods swung wildly. One moment he was charming, the next consumed by anger or despair. Meredith knew from the beginning that Aaron was different. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, with a kind of fierce intensity that was both alluring and terrifying. For a while she kept things professional. Aaron was, after all, her patient, and his erratic behavior made her cautious. But as with Matthew and Daniel, Meredith soon found herself crossing lines she swore she never would. Aaron had a way of pulling her in, of making her feel like she was the only person who could save him from himself. He'd show up at her office unannounced, sometimes in the middle of the night, demanding to see her, insisting that she was the only one who understood him. Meredith should have known better. She had already become too entangled with Matthew and Daniel. But something about Aaron was different. He wasn't like the others. He didn't just want her attention, he craved it. And the more Meredith tried to distance herself from him, the more obsessed Aaron became. Soon, Aaron was showing up outside her house, leaving notes on her car, waiting for her after hours. His obsession grew darker, and with it, so did Meredith's fear. But despite knowing how dangerous it was to continue their relationship, she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to his intensity, to the fire behind his eyes. By now, Meredith's life was a mess of secrets and lies. She was juggling three men, each of them demanding more from her, each of them pushing her further into a corner. And while she told herself she had everything under control, the truth was far more dangerous. Aaron's obsession wasn't something she could ignore. And as his behavior became more erratic, Meredith began to fear what would happen if she tried to end things with him. Aaron wasn't like Matthew or Daniel. He wasn't content with being pushed aside. He wanted all of her, and if he couldn't have her, he wasn't going to let anyone else take his place. What had once been exciting for Meredith, the thrill of being desired, the rush of keeping secrets, was now turning into a nightmare. The walls of her carefully constructed life were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Meredith had always prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize her life, keeping her professional world as a doctor completely separate from the secret affairs she was entangled in. But now, with three men vying for her attention, the walls between those worlds were crumbling, and fast. Matthew, ever the dominant and controlling presence, had begun to sense something was wrong. He had always believed that he held Meredith's full attention, that she was his and his alone. But lately she had grown distant, distracted. Meredith wasn't as attentive as she once was, and Matthew, with his natural jealousy, began to suspect there was someone else. He confronted her one evening, showing up unannounced at her clinic, demanding answers. "Who else are you seeing?" he snapped, his voice low but furious. Meredith, caught off guard, tried to reassure him, but her hesitation only made him more suspicious. Matthew wasn't the type of man to share, and the thought that Meredith might be giving her time, her affection, to someone else drove him into a jealous rage. He started following her, watching her movements, showing up at odd hours to catch her in the act. It was becoming harder and harder for Meredith to maintain her secret relationships. The strain was taking its toll, not just on her personal life, but professionally as well. She found herself distracted at work, struggling to keep up the facade of the calm, caring doctor her patients relied on. Meanwhile, Daniel, the emotionally fragile one, was becoming more dependent on her than ever before. His anxiety attacks were growing more frequent, and his calls, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of her day, were becoming relentless. He needed her in a way that was suffocating, but Meredith couldn't bring herself to cut him off. He was so fragile, so dependent, and deep down, she craved that feeling of being needed. But Daniel's dependency was becoming dangerous. He had started showing up at her home, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his voice desperate as he begged her to help him through another panic attack. Meredith, flattered by his devotion but increasingly overwhelmed, knew she should set boundaries. Yet, she couldn't, not with Daniel. He saw her as his lifeline, and Meredith was addicted to the power that gave her. But it was Aaron who terrified her the most. His obsession had reached new heights, and Meredith could feel the danger in every encounter they had. Aaron wasn't like the others. His emotions were volatile, unpredictable. He wasn't content with waiting in the shadows anymore. He wanted all of her, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. The walls between her relationships were collapsing, and the men were growing restless. Matthew's jealousy, Daniel's desperation, and Aaron's obsession were converging, and Meredith was running out of ways to keep them apart. She was losing control, and deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around her. As the weeks went on, Meredith found herself spiraling deeper into the web of lies she had spun. Her once carefully controlled double life was unraveling, and no matter how hard she tried to keep everything together, the cracks were showing. Each of the three men wanted more from her. More time, more affection, more commitment, and it was becoming impossible to keep them satisfied. Matthew, growing more suspicious by the day, had started making threats. He was no longer just showing up unannounced at her clinic. Now he was questioning her at every turn. His jealousy had morphed into something darker, something more dangerous. He wasn't just possessive anymore. He was becoming controlling, following her, watching her every move. Meredith knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. The lies were too deep, and she was too far gone. Daniel, meanwhile, had become a constant source of emotional pressure. His anxiety attacks were more frequent, his need for her more desperate. He called her several times a day, sometimes just to hear her voice. And Meredith, feeling a mix of guilt and obligation, always answered. She was trapped, unable to pull away from his emotional neediness. And with every call, every late-night conversation, she felt the weight of her decisions closing in on her. But it was Aaron who frightened her the most. Aaron's obsession had taken a darker turn, and he was no longer hiding it. He had started showing up outside her house, leaving long, rambling notes on her car, messages that veered between declarations of undying love and bitter accusations of betrayal. He wanted her all to himself, and if he couldn't have her, he was going to make sure no one else could. One cold winter night, everything came to a head. Aaron arrived at Meredith's doorstep, pounding on the door with such force she thought he might break it down. His face was pale, gaunt from lack of sleep, and twisted with desperation. "You promised you wouldn't abandon me," he yelled, his voice raw with emotion. "You said you understood me. Why are you pulling away now? Is it because of them? Matthew? Daniel? You think I don't know?" Meredith stood frozen in the doorway, her heart racing. She had never seen Aaron like this before. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic, and for the first time, she felt a real sense of danger. "Aaron, you need to calm down," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This can't go on like this. You need help, real help." But Aaron wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You're just like everyone else," he spat, his voice filled with rage. "You're going to throw me away when I'm no longer useful to you." Meredith tried to reason with him, her voice trembling. "I'm not throwing you away, Aaron, but you need to go home. We can talk later when you've had time to calm down." Aaron's expression darkened. "I don't want to go home," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I can't live without you." The argument escalated, and Aaron, driven by a dangerous mix of obsession and rage, made a veiled threat. "If you don't leave Matthew and Daniel," he hissed, "I'll tell the whole town about us. I'll ruin you if I have to." Meredith's blood ran cold. This was the moment she had feared all along, the moment when her secret life would come crashing down around her. And now, Aaron was holding all the power. Meredith stood in her doorway, trembling as Aaron stormed off into the night, leaving her standing in the freezing cold. Her mind raced, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Aaron had crossed a line, one she had feared for weeks, but now it was real. His threats weren't idle. She knew that if she didn't do something, her entire world would come crashing down. For the next few days, Meredith lived in constant fear. Aaron's behavior became more erratic, more threatening. He sent her messages at all hours of the day and night, some filled with apologies, others with dark, unsettling promises. He was watching her, waiting for her to make a move, and Meredith felt trapped in a nightmare she had created. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daniel were becoming more suspicious of Meredith's behavior. Matthew, already possessive and controlling, began to notice her growing distance. He questioned her every time he saw her, his jealousy rising with each passing day. He showed up at her clinic unannounced, watching her interactions with other patients, his eyes always searching for signs of betrayal. Daniel, on the other hand, was growing more emotionally unstable. His dependency on Meredith had reached a fever pitch, and the thought of losing her sent him spiraling into deep depression. His phone calls became more frequent, his anxiety attacks more severe. Meredith was his lifeline, and without her, he felt like he had nothing. But he wasn't angry like Matthew or obsessive like Aaron. Daniel was simply desperate. The tension in Meredith's life had reached a boiling point. She was juggling 3 men, each with their own needs and demands, and she was running out of ways to keep them apart. The walls she had built between them were collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The weight of her secrets was crushing her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Then came the night of Aaron's death. Meredith had received another barrage of frantic messages from Aaron earlier in the evening. He was angry, accusing her of leading him on, of using him for her own emotional needs, and then discarding him when he became too much. But this time, Meredith had decided not to respond. She hoped that if she ignored him, he would eventually calm down, give up, and leave her alone. But Aaron wasn't the kind of man to be ignored. He had decided that this night was going to be the end of everything, one way or another. When Aaron arrived at Meredith's house that night, he was more volatile than ever. He wasn't just angry, he was unhinged. He accused her of abandoning him, of playing with his emotions, and of destroying his life. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I'm going to tell everyone what you've done. I'm going to ruin you, Meredith." Meredith, terrified and desperate to calm him down, tried to reason with him. "Aaron, please," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "You don't need to do this. We can talk about it later. Just, please go home." But Aaron wouldn't listen. He stormed out of her house, slamming the door behind him, leaving Meredith standing in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew something terrible was about to happen, but she was powerless to stop it. Hours later, Aaron was found dead in his apartment, an apparent overdose. But something about the scene didn't sit right with the investigators. The pills found in his system were prescribed by Meredith, but the dosage was far higher than anything she had ever recommended. And there were other signs. Small things like the position of his body and the way the pills were scattered that suggested something far more sinister had taken place. The discovery of Aaron's body sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Salisbury. What initially appeared to be an overdose quickly turned into a full-scale investigation when the detectives, Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs, arrived at the scene. They had seen their share of suicides and accidental deaths, but something about Aaron's case felt off. At first glance, it looked like a tragic end to a troubled young man's life. Pills were scattered around his body, and his apartment was a mess, evidence of his emotional turmoil. But as Sarah and Mark examined the scene more closely, they noticed small but significant details that pointed to foul play. The pill bottle, for one, was too neatly placed next to Aaron's hand. His body position seemed unnatural, and there was a faint bruise on his wrist, as if someone had been there with him during his final moments. Sarah, always methodical in her approach, started digging into Aaron's phone records. What she found immediately caught her attention: dozens of late-night messages to none other than Dr. Meredith Larson. Some were desperate and rambling, others angry and accusatory. The messages painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control, but they also hinted at something more: a complex and dangerous relationship between Aaron and his doctor. Meredith was brought in for questioning the next morning. She greeted the detectives with her usual calm demeanor, the practiced air of a doctor who had spent decades dealing with emotional patients. But Sarah could see the tension in her eyes, the subtle shift in her body language when they mentioned Aaron's name. "Dr. Larson, you were treating Aaron Cole for his emotional instability, correct?" Sarah asked, her tone neutral but probing. "Yes," Meredith replied, her voice steady. "I'd been helping him manage his anxiety and depression for several months. He was a complicated patient." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Complicated how?" Meredith hesitated for just a moment, and Sarah caught it. "He relied on me for more than just medical advice," Meredith said carefully. "I suppose I became something of a confidant for him." "A confidant?" Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That seems like a lot of responsibility for a doctor to take on." Meredith shifted in her seat, the first sign of discomfort she had shown. Aaron didn't have many people he could talk to. He needed someone to listen. As the interview progressed, it became clear to the detectives that there was much more to Meredith's relationship with Aaron than she was letting on. She admitted to prescribing him the medication that was found in his system, but the dosage was far lower than what had killed him. And as Sarah pressed her on the nature of her relationship with Aaron, Meredith grew more guarded, her calm demeanor starting to crack. But it wasn't just Meredith's behavior that raised red flags. As Sarah and Mark began interviewing others in Aaron's life, they discovered two other names that kept coming up: Matthew Granger and Daniel Ward, both of whom had also been under Meredith's care. Matthew was the first to be brought in for questioning, and his attitude immediately set off alarm bells. He was defensive, almost hostile, when asked about Aaron. "I don't know what you're getting at," Matthew snapped. "I barely knew the guy. Whatever happened to him has nothing to do with me." But as the detectives pressed him, cracks in Matthew's story began to show. He admitted that he had been romantically involved with Meredith, but insisted it was over. "She didn't have time for me anymore," Matthew said bitterly. "She was too busy with all her other patients, including Aaron." His words were dismissive, but Sarah could hear the resentment in his voice. Could Matthew's jealousy have driven him to confront Aaron? Or was there more to the story than he was letting on? Next came Daniel Ward. Daniel was a stark contrast to Matthew. Nervous, fidgeting in his seat, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He seemed fragile, emotionally broken, and Sarah could tell that whatever he knew, it weighed heavily on him. "I didn't know Aaron well," Daniel said quietly, "but I knew about him. Meredith mentioned him a few times. I could tell she was worried about him." When asked about the night of Aaron's death, Daniel hesitated, his gaze shifting away from the detectives. I wasn't there," he stammered, but his body language betrayed him. Something was wrong. As Sarah and Mark pieced together the growing puzzle, it became clear that Meredith's relationships with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron were far more entangled than anyone had realized. And one of those relationships had led to Aaron's death. As the investigation deepened, it became impossible to ignore the tangled web of relationships that Meredith had cultivated with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron. Detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs had gathered enough evidence to know that Aaron's death was no simple overdose. Now, the question wasn't just about who had administered the fatal dose, it was about why. The forensic team had a breakthrough when they discovered traces of another person's DNA on the pill bottle found at Aaron's apartment. That DNA belonged to Daniel Ward. This revelation rocked the investigation. Daniel, the quiet, fragile patient, had been in Aaron's apartment the night he died. But why? What had driven him there? And more importantly, what had happened? Daniel was brought in for further questioning, and this time, the weight of his guilt was too much for him to bear. Tears streamed down his face as he broke down, confessing to being at Aaron's apartment the night he died. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Daniel sobbed, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to talk to him." According to Daniel, he had grown increasingly jealous of Aaron's relationship with Meredith. He had known, deep down, that Meredith had been seeing Aaron outside of their therapy sessions. It ate away at him, driving him deeper into a spiral of insecurity and fear. On the night of Aaron's death, Daniel had followed him to his apartment, desperate to confront him and end the rivalry he believed existed between them. But when Daniel arrived, Aaron was already in the midst of a breakdown. Surrounded by pills and alcohol, Aaron was ranting about Meredith, accusing her of using him, abandoning him, just as he had accused her the night he stormed out of her house. Daniel, overwhelmed by the situation and his own emotional instability, tried to calm Aaron down. But his anxiety took hold, and instead of helping, Daniel did the unthinkable. "He kept saying he wanted to end it all," Daniel whispered. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I gave him the pills, he'd calm down, but he just kept taking more." The detectives listened intently as Daniel described how Aaron had taken the pills, at first willingly, then erratically. Daniel, consumed by his own panic, had done nothing to stop him. In his mind, Aaron's death felt inevitable, and he had convinced himself that he was just a bystander to Aaron's self-destruction. But the detectives weren't convinced that Daniel's involvement was entirely passive. The traces of his DNA on the pill bottle, the scattered pills, and Aaron's final messages to Meredith all pointed to something much darker. Meredith herself remained under suspicion throughout the investigation. The detectives knew she had played a central role in the lives of all three men, manipulating their emotions, blurring the lines between professional care and personal desire. Could she have pushed Daniel to confront Aaron, knowing that the tension between them could lead to tragedy? Was she pulling the strings behind the scenes, using her patient's vulnerabilities to cover her tracks? As the trial drew near, the secrets Meredith had fought so hard to keep hidden were finally laid bare in court. The small town of Salisbury, once so trusting of their beloved physician, watched in disbelief as the details of her double life unfolded. The media latched onto the scandal, turning it into a national story of love, betrayal, and murder. The prosecution presented a damning case against Meredith, painting her as a woman who had violated the trust of her patients by engaging in inappropriate relationships and manipulating them for her own emotional gain. They argued that her actions had directly contributed to Aaron's death, that her control over the vulnerable men under her care had created a toxic, dangerous situation. Daniel's defense centered on his fragile mental state, claiming that he had been emotionally manipulated by Meredith and had acted out of desperation. His attorneys argued that Daniel hadn't intended to harm Aaron, that he had been caught in a tragic situation beyond his control. In the end, the jury found Daniel Ward guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing him to 15 years in prison. His mental state and the emotional manipulation he had suffered at Meredith's hands were taken into account, but it was clear that his actions had directly led to Aaron's death. As for Meredith, she was acquitted of murder but found guilty of professional misconduct and gross negligence. The jury determined that her inappropriate relationships with her patients had created the conditions that allowed Aaron's death to occur. She lost her medical license and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, avoiding prison but losing everything she had built over her long career. When the dust settled, Meredith was left to face the devastating consequences of her actions. Her once thriving clinic was closed for good, her reputation in ruins. The town of Salisbury, once trusting and respectful of their beloved doctor, now viewed her as a woman who had allowed her personal desires to cloud her professional judgment, leading to a young man's tragic death. Thank you for watching. If this story gripped you as much as it did the nation, leave a comment with a 0, and if not, drop a 1. Don't forget to check out more intriguing cases on our channel.